We are recording. Okay. Let me know if I can do something for you.
Okay, no, my computer's just having a heart attack.
Oh, do not worry. Still missing people here. Just 3 of my students.
Yeah, it's a bit early.
Te perdió el Iberobús. La mato. La mato.
¡Ay, qué pobre!
La mato.
Yo estuve a nada de no venir.
¿Te mato?
A nada, y dije, no, no lo puedo hacer bajar.
Te dijo, ¿verdad?
No, y así lo hubieras hecho. ¿Papá tenía la camadero? Ajá, sí.
I got some Italian espresso here for
Oh,
you.
great.
You'll be able to share. My students love it. Oh, the call for paper for SCSC is out.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah. Excellent.
Are you planning on going?
Absolutely.
Terrific.
Yeah. James Clifton will kill me. I won't show up.
No, pues hasta la clase. No,
Coffee?
para que la ropa
Coffee?
Yes. Es porque necesito descansar.
Es la Tienes una estrella en el mentón.
Sí, uno de los
Okay, how does that look?
It looks great. Absolutely wonderful.
Terrific. Okay, let me resize it a
Yes.
little bit. That's probably
Let's wait 5 minutes if it's okay with you.
absolutely.
Do you hear me okay?
Okay, so there's some people who are entering
Yeah.
the waiting room. I'm going to admit them.
Okay, I already do. Yeah, they are the people for the YouTube channel.
Ah, okay.
We are going to be live in our social media and in YouTube.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Paula, how are you?
Hola, hola por allá. I'm going to start the transmission to YouTube.
Perfect, Paula.
If Javier wants to tell a few words in 2 minutes, you can start the class. Just give me 2 minutes and I'll let you know when it's, you'll see the transmission.
You have 3 minutes and a half, and anyway, I'm recording the session.
Okay.
How was the wedding in San Miguel?
Very warm during the day and at
Oh,
night.
yeah, I
Right.
thought so. But San Miguel is wonderful.
Yes.
Have you ever been to San Miguel Allende, Kathleen?
I have not.
It's a wonderful place in Guanajuato.
Javier, ¿podrás hacerme un minutito coanfitriona para poder,
Te hago anfitriona toda la sesión
Ajá.
si quieres.
Es nada más, ya regreso para que no haya ningún tema
Done.
de compartir la pantalla.
Ya te hice coanfitriona, somos anfitriones todos. Oh.
Ay, todo muy bonita la boda.
No saben.
No, es que yo fui a otra boda.
Ah, ok. Creí que era la boda de la que estaba hablando.
Ay, qué rico. ¿Qué crees? No voy a ninguna boda.
Everything okay with you in your side, Kathleen, at your end?
Yeah, I can hear you great. And my computer stopped seizing up, so.
Okay, our tech support is actually quite good, and as you can see, our camera is automatic, so the camera centers the person who is talking.
Okay.
Habla, Dani.
Hello.
Oh,
There you have Danny and Kyla and
Paulina.
Jimena and Pau. We are still missing 3 other students, but you are live on the YouTube channel and in Instagram.
Okay.
Okay, and when Paola gives us the signal, we will start. Wait,
Javier, una preguntita. ¿En tu
Dime.
pantalla te sale la opción de transmitir en vivo en tu Zoom?
Tendría que buscar por dónde.
En
En
el
el
menú,
más, en los puntitos.
en el menú de Zoom hasta abajo, donde tiene seguridad, participantes, compartir pantalla, en los 3 puntitos de más, ¿a ti te sale la opción?
Estoy grabando, me sale chat, pausar grabación, detener grabación y salas.
Ok, no, entonces, denme un segundito, estoy teniendo un pequeño problema técnico. Me
Esperamos.
había sucedido, pero ahí voy, ¿eh?
De todas formas, Paola, recuerda que lo estamos grabando.
Sí, perfecto.
Okay, Kathleen, just a sec. We are trying to get live in Instagram and in YouTube.
Oh,
Paola is a teacher in the department and she helps us with that.
okay.
Paola, whenever you're ready, okay? No worries.
Javi,
Yep.
me acaba de decir Paula que tampoco me ve.
Sí. Démelo.
Bueno, pero conmigo.
Vamos, con Caro, con Paola y con Frida.
No, cara se bien. Yo la vi en yo la digo bien. Sí, sí, yo la
Perdón.
vi. Nada.
Esto no está bien.
Se me da punto extra.
Está bien, son 93.
Punto extra para venir puntual.
Oh,
Sí. No, no. No. No te da a ti.
¿Sí puedes, Paola?
Algo pasó con la configuración de la cuenta, si quieren iniciar, y después tú y yo nos arreglamos para poder subirla a Facebook, a YouTube, perdón.
Okay. Okay, if it is okay with you, Kathleen, I'm gonna introduce you.
Yeah, it's trying to get the volume up a little bit. It seems to have dropped somehow.
I did nothing.
Okay. Well, then, yeah, I'm ready to go when you are.
Okay. Morning, girls.
Good morning.
Morning, Danny. Morning, Kyla. Morning, Pau. Kathleen is professor of history at Georgia Southern University. She teaches there early modern European history, world history, and historical methods.
Oh.
Exactly the same we do here. She's the author of a huge number of papers and monographs, and she's currently writing a book about the Medici Grand Duchesses Giovanna d'Austria and Bianca Capelli.
Oh.
One novel women in Italy, 16th century. Hi, Caro. She's also the main researcher, the principal investigator of European Jesuit Libraries Provenance Project. It's the biggest database on Jesuit libraries all over the world. They know everything of what, when, where, exactly. The project focuses on books owned by Jesuit libraries in Europe prior to the suppression of the Society of Jesus, 1767. And with the help of the students, she's developing a database of women printers in Europe up to the late 18th century. She's an associate editor. She's actually the boss of the Journal of Jesuit Studies and the former president of 16th Century Society and Conference, and has spearheaded multiple efforts to mentor emerging scholars as they begin their teaching and publishing careers. via the society and the Renaissance Society. She's my friend.
No.
We meet each other in a plane, actually, going to San Diego. And I am part of the board of 16th Century Society, mainly because of Kathleen help and Kathleen friendship. I treasure my friendship with Kathleen. Thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate you being here with us. You have a lot to learn from people like Kathleen. She's one of the smartest person I know everywhere in the world. Thank you very much, Kathleen, for being here. Thank you very much for the friendship. And these four students are actually four of the most gifted students I ever had. They have wonderful research projects going on, and if we have time at the end, I would love they to talk about their projects, but we'll see in Q&A. We are yours. The stage is yours. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that very flattering introduction and for asking me to do this. Very happy to meet all of the students, and I've tried to work this so that there's time to ask questions. I am at the moment teaching actually an undergraduate historical methods class, and so I'm folding in some of the stuff that I talk with them about. And I've also taught the graduate research class, but today I'm just gonna sort of give you an overview about some primary source research, because there's as I'm sure you've discussed in your classes, there are certain requirements that we do in historical disciplines that ensure that we go back to the sources at all times. And I've kept a running count of how many archives and libraries I've been to, because I have a tendency to choose topics, not deliberately, it just happens this way, that are hard to find a lot of direct documents on. So I'm always looking for the sort of contextual documents. And since I started my graduate work last century, I believe I've probably been to 100 different archives and libraries. So what wisdom I can give you, I hope to do so. And I've asked what I call the usual adverbial questions here about researching in libraries, how you do it, why you do it, and so what. So I want to start with, if this will cooperate. Yes. Why manuscripts matter. And excuse me, it's very easy to get lost in the present and the way that we think about things and the easy accessibility of records. And a lot of the emphasis in the United States, at least, has been over the last 20 years moving away from pre-modern studies to mostly modern studies. So it's easy to forget that most of the records that humans have created throughout history have been written. Which means that it's really important that we learn how people write, in the sense of, you know, what the writing looks like, therefore paleography, but also what it means to write a manuscript. That is to say that jottings, little things that people write down as notes, things that you write in the margins, things that you write when you're listening to somebody else speak. I think those reveal at least as much as official records. And one example that I find particularly interesting is a few years ago, I was at a library doing some research on this Jesuit Libraries project, and I noticed a very clear pattern, which is that much like students today, students in the early modern period read rather thoroughly and carefully and took lots of notes at the beginning of the book. And then it started very slowly falling off, so that somewhere towards the half of the book, there's a lot fewer notes. They lost interest, they got busy or something like that. And even that can tell you a good deal. Note also that drafts are as important as final versions. In working with the Grand Duchesses, I'm doing a lot of reading of letters. And sometimes it's just not possible to go to all of the places where somebody has written a letter to. So if I want to look at the correspondence of the Grand Dukes and the Grand Duchesses, I can go to Florence and I can find all of their drafts. And I don't have to also go to Paris and Vienna and wherever they were writing to different parts of Poland and England. You know, they're not as neat as the final versions, but drafts are often very important. Drafts can also show you how people's thinking changes. You print, and I still do this myself. You can see I've written all over. Well, actually, you can't see because I have my background blurred. Sorry about that. I write all over my drafts to show you, and that shows you what I'm thinking. Letters, back to the issue of letters and diaries, are often more candid, and they're certainly always more personal than public records. They're not always more candid than public records because there are people who write letters and diaries that are important for official reasons. You know, Supreme Court justices, presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, they write letters and diaries that they know other people are going to read, unlike the rest of us. But those are still generally more personal than public records. It's not a law, it's a discussion instead. Now, at the same time, I obviously work with a lot of printed works, and they matter for a lot of reasons. Printed works include official records, laws, edicts, proclamations, even train schedules, which are fundamental to understanding what society requires of you. That is to say, what are your expectations? What are the potential punishments for doing something wrong? Public documentation gives you a lot of context about the government and about the law, which everyday writings don't generally tend to do. People won't write in their diaries about how they broke a particular law very frequently. But you can also trace changes in the law and in government by looking at different public documentation. Things like arrest records are used an awful lot for sociological research, for example, to show you a big problem that we have in the United States with the way that people of different races and different classes are treated in a particular legal context and given particular crimes. When you're talking about books as opposed to individual documents, that generally means information that people and organizations wish a lot of people will have access to. So, you know, people who write history books and other academic books always hope that we have a large audience. That's not going to be as large an audience as, of course, your popular literature. Nevertheless, both standard works of, say, economics, history, art history, music history, etc., reflect fashions. There are modes in historical interpretation. There are things which are more important to historians writing now than they were 20 years ago. But they also reflect standards. Things generally don't get published without an awful lot of work, which is why once a book is out, like a computer, once it hits the shelves, it's a little bit outdated. That doesn't mean that it isn't important and that it isn't still useful, but you understand that articles generally are fresher than books because they take less time to produce. The physical object itself, the size of the book, the condition of the
question.
Oh, sure.
A quick one. When you are talking about fashion and standards, are you talking about methodological fashions, historiographical fashions, or more as anachronism?
All of the above. I mean, for example, there are books that are deliberately preserved, right? And some of those are extremely expensive, and they took a lot to produce, and they're presentation copies. And there are other books which are equally important, but they fall apart because somebody didn't take care of them. You know, they're in a library that's got a lot of humidity, or they were destroyed in a war. There's a lot of reasons why books or papers can be destroyed no matter how important they are.
Okay.
But in terms of fashions, you know, like I think, for example, about how when I was in college, women's history was still sort of a niche thing, and only sociologists talked about race, historians didn't. And so, you know, if you read stuff that was printed in the 1950s, it's mostly this great man view of history. And then by the time you get to the 70s, that's starting to change, but it's not mainstream in the 80s when I was in college. And these days, if you don't talk about race and class and gender, then you're outside of the mainstream.
Okay.
All right. So a couple of things about archives versus libraries. Most of you won't have a lot of experience in archives, but you've seen a lot of libraries, and maybe you didn't think terribly deeply about them, but they are very deliberately organized, as are archives. So a few things that archives and libraries have in common. Both of them will preserve printed texts. Both preserve rare or other special materials, excuse me, and those vary really widely. So, for example, there's a university not so far from where I live that has a collection of the works of Flannery O'Connor, who's a really important Georgia author from the mid 20th century. It's not that her papers, because they belong to her, are considered rare because nobody else has a copy of them, but it's not as rare as, say, Magna Carta, right? It doesn't have the large impact that something along those lines would have. Nevertheless, there are special collections associated with place and with time, and they have different departments in order to do things like keep the humidity low and make sure that access is restricted. Which gets us to this issue of preservation. There's a tendency to assume that archivists care more about keeping materials than they do about making materials available. And I'll grant you there are some archivists that are like that, but for the most part, they want to keep them safe because they want you to see them. So they're going to watch you closely. They're going to make sure that you have pencil instead of pen. You don't bring in large bags that you can sneak things out of, et cetera, because these things do happen still. But the point is that they all respect the documents as much as they respect your right to use documents or books.
I remember fondly the chief librarian in the Nettie Benson Library in Texas University in Austin. And the guy was exactly as you said, a very concerned man about preservation of materials. So it was quite difficult. They have geographical relationships of 16th century Mexico. They have a huge collection of rare materials. But the most interesting thing is the guy's name was Hieronymus. So
okay.
the joke tells itself. It was very funny when arriving to the Nettie Benson Library and hi, Mr. Hieronymus, are you able to lend us some of your materials? No, at all. So it was more an archive than a library in the sense you're using right now.
You know, when I got here to Georgia Southern, they had just hired a librarian by the name of Bede, Bede, like the English saint who's famous for his library collections.
Okay.
Sometimes people go into
yeah, the right direction.
There's, you know, sometimes your names can determine your life, right? The thing to keep in mind, of course, with this issue of preservation is that access really is part of preservation. So you'll find that every time a rare book librarian puts something online, there's this group of people who scream about how she's not wearing gloves or how could he possibly do that with bare fingers? Gloves will rip documents. You know, rare book librarians and archivists don't use gloves. And so, you know, they're actually really quite careful and they want you to be every bit as careful. And of course, it happens occasionally. I do remember turning a page and the page cracking at least once in an archive in Florence. And what they do is they take it into preservation, and it may take a few weeks, which is unfortunate, to fix it. But they don't want to hide the documents from you. They just want you to be careful with them. So in terms of differences, archives do have printed works, but libraries specialize in bound printed works, and archives specialize in newspapers. So often I think you should probably consider, just as you've been saying, Javier, that special collections do work rather a lot like archives, especially when they have these newspapers. Libraries, of course, have to appeal to a much wider public than archives do. They have much longer hours. Special collections tend to have archive hours. Libraries will need to make room for people just to sit and read, even books that they've brought in themselves. Libraries have coffee shops, at least in the US. Libraries have a lot of popular fiction, and they highlight these things. Archives won't do that. But what's probably most important as you're first starting to use archives is to understand the organizational structure. In the United States, we have two main ones. The Dewey Decimal System modified the Library of Congress system, which has also been modified multiple times over the years. If the cataloging practice is not modified, it's troublesome. So there's, I can't remember exactly where it was published, but there's this famous article that Umberto Eco wrote years ago about, and it's called something along the lines of how to create an Italian library. And it is absolutely spot on, because what Italian libraries tend to do is they have this collection, and then somebody donates a collection to them in their will, and they start re-cataloging at that point. That collection has its own catalog. It doesn't matter if it's the same books, similar books, same subjects, whatever. It's just an entirely different catalog. They do this with archives too. The State Archive in Florence, for example, has an entire collection which is simply called manuscripts, which means nothing. And they have another collection which is called gifts and donations, which is basically just this large selection of things that have been given to them in the 20th century. So you have to understand that if you go there, for example, like I do for the Medici records, you're going to need to look in the Medici Avanti il Principato, the Medici in this Grand Ducal period, the Miscellanea Medicea, the miscellaneous papers associated with the Medici, and then you have to look in Acquisti and Doni, and then you have to look in Manoscritti, and you also have to look in the private family collections of the important families who were around during the Medici period. Like there's an entire collection of Strozzi family collections. So bring a lot of patience with you when you go to libraries. So,
actually, catalogs are always madness, because I was just remember about the drawings collection in Uffizi, and the catalogs are chaotic. Actually, it's very, very difficult to find something, because their system is quite old, but also they have not cataloged the whole thing, so they have a lot of uncatalogued drawings, and that's the main fun, actually, uncatalogued drawings. So it's, as you said, it's nothing. It's useless.
and it's, it depends on which archivist you get. They may be extremely helpful to you and say, okay, I'm just going to bring you stuff and you can look through it. Or they may just say to you, no, there's nothing. A conversation that I had with somebody in the rare book room in the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze, I swear to you, they told me that there was probably nothing about the Grand Duchesses in there. It's like, where else is it going to be? I mean, it's certainly in the rare book collection in the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze, but this person didn't want to spend the time looking. So, sometimes you get people who are not very good at their jobs.
Well, Italian bureaucracy is crazy too.
It's yeah, Florence is particularly famous for this. It's not like I've never had this problem in Siena or Pisa. But and so my caveat here is not just the one that I've written down, which is that all organizational systems have biases. But that some organizational systems are not particularly organized. The thing about biases is something that is hard to correct for, but it's still important to keep in mind. One of the reasons that the Library of Congress cataloging system was developed for libraries in the United States is because the Dewey Decimal System, which is used in some modified form in a lot of libraries around the world, actually, has very clear biases towards, well, white male history, to put it bluntly. There was no room in the initial, it was devised in the late 19th century, and there was no room in the initial Dewey Decimal System for the discussion of immigration. There was no room for talk about class, about women, about minorities, etc. So you have to look carefully through subjects and through sub-subjects in order to find these once you know the biases. Again, those have been corrected a lot over the years, but it's taking a lot of time. So I wouldn't expect any library system to be particularly great at something other than the history of the majority of a particular country. So learn flexible keywords, in other words. All right, so just a little bit about my experiences. And this is, the background here is a picture of what's called the Beinecke Rare Book Library in Yale. It's an absolutely stupendous place, and I recommend that and a number of other places that I've been to, like the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and Princeton University's library. They have these small research grants so that you can stay for a month. They'll, between $2,500, which is a small amount of money, and $5,000 for you to just immerse yourself in those collections.
The Latin American Studies program in Princeton is great, and usually is devoted to Latin American scholars. So it's a great program.
And their library, the librarians there are very friendly and supportive. I definitely suggest going there. So this is just the abbreviations of the states where I've and the District of Columbia where I've done some research. I went to I did my PhD program at the University of Wisconsin. I'm from New York. I have taught in, of course, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, and Texas. And just over the years, because of where I am, when I was in Kansas, I went to Missouri because I was right near the state line. We spend part of our summers in Maryland so that I can go to the Folger and the Library of Congress. Yale is in Connecticut. Chicago is in Illinois. I've spent some time there. What else here? Louisiana, because I've been to a couple conferences there. New Jersey is where Princeton is. Ohio is on the the Kentucky-Indiana border, etc. So a couple things to keep in mind. There is a very large public library system in the United States. They're not all interconnected. They are associated with states. And in particular with large cities in this. So you have these vast scholarly libraries in places like Cincinnati, New York, Los Angeles, but it will depend very much on the subject. So if, for example, you're really interested in African-American history, you want to go to this particular branch of the Washington, D.C. Public Library. If you're interested in the history of music, you want to go to a particular branch of the New York Public Library, etc. And then even in my small town, which has about 30,000, well, no, maybe 40,000 by now people, there is a small, not scholarly library, but we have some collections associated with the history of Statesboro and Bullitt County. Then there's also university libraries. Those depend largely on Library of Congress. There are some older cataloging systems that are still in use for books that are rarely in circulation just because nobody has the money to update every book. So for example, in the University of Wisconsin, there's still a few that use this system called Cutter. But most public libraries use Dewey and most university libraries use Library of Congress. Keep in mind, large universities will often have multiple libraries. This is not like in England, which we'll talk briefly about. They're all in the United States, all university libraries are in the same cataloging system, and they focus on specific things. So there's the general library, but then you also will have like a law school or a medical school. There are a number of major universities that will have an art history library. Princeton's one of them, University of Wisconsin's another, and they have their own special collections. But if you're going to do local history, keep in mind that you want the public history, the local historical society, which will generally talk about a library and their own collection. They don't call it an archive, but it is a collection. The same thing with State Historical Society, and the library of the nearest public university, because they have those special collections that you want. This is the University of Toronto library, and I've done some research there and at a university in North Vancouver called Simon Fraser University. They use a system called Class FC, which is quite similar to the Library of Congress. So if you know the way that the subject divisions are arranged in Library of Congress, you should feel fairly well at home in Canadian libraries too. And like in the United States, large universities have multiple libraries with the same general divisions. But it's pretty different in Europe. So somewhere here, this is the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze, where I've spent a lot of time, and I have both loved and hated it. Principally, I've worked in Florence, and then secondarily in Rome, including Vatican City and Siena, other parts of Tuscany, including some of the smaller towns, Bologna, Florence, Ferrara, Mantua, Modena, and Venice. Always write in advance to the place that you're going to. Italians are very ceremonial in a lot of ways. So just showing up rarely works. You will get a much better reception if you write in advance and say, I hope to meet with you to discuss my project. And then when you go bring with you whatever official documentation you can have that shows what university you are affiliated with. I kid you not. I went to a library in Florence in the late 90s while I was living there, and I had stopped bringing my passport with me because I regularly went to the same places. They knew me, so they accepted my driver's license instead. So I went to this smaller library in Florence, and I asked for this manuscript, and they said, well, you need to have your passport. And I said, well, I don't have it. I just have it. All I have today with me is the driver's license. I guess I should come back. And she said, you know, anybody can have a driver's license. I said, the only other thing I have is a business card. And she said, well, of course we'll use a business card. And I thought, she's given me a 16th century manuscript with a business card. I mean, you could print those things off your home printer. She didn't accept my driver's license. They're very impressed by business cards. I don't know why. Make sure that you explore the web page extensively, though, because it has a lot of things on it, like we're open every Tuesday except the third Tuesday of the month, which is kind of an important thing. Generally not highlighted, but it can be found there. And make sure that you understand that there's really not a lot of libraries and archives that allow you to drill too deep down. Actually, the State Archive in Florence is one of the better ones, but they've been experiencing some weird issues lately where their web page is not always available outside of. And I think this is in part in reaction to that horrific denial of service attack that's affected the British Library. Some days you can get everything you need on the State Archive in Florence, and sometimes you can, actually, it's not just in Florence, it's the whole system. So find out as much as you can about the collection practices, but also the names of documents, and if possible, the numbers of documents. You may be able to register and get a few documents put aside for you in advance. That's so that you don't show up and then have to wait a day in order to get your documents. But always have a backup plan. What's not going to be online is if your documents or books are in use, or if they are Sorry?
Yeah, these recommendations are particularly useful for Hispanic countries. I mean, in my experience, the similarities between Italian archives and libraries, and Spanish archives and libraries, and Latin American archives and libraries are based in the fact that they all controlled by state.
Mhm.
Or the church, which is even worse. And yeah, you're completely right. Never go unannounced, never go by surprise. Have as many as possible recommendation letters from everyone. And
Yes.
and yeah, ceremonial is a word that defines very well the kind of relationships you can expect from librarians and chief of archives and stuff like that. And also be surprised, be prepared for surprises too. I mean, you can do a long travel with all due recommendations and letters and phone calls and stuff, and yet you can find the archive closed and you need to have something else to do.
Right. That thing about being closed on the third Tuesday, for example, happened to me, and it actually wasn't on the webpage. And the person, they were very surprised when I tried to get in, because it says it's open every Tuesday. And the person said to me, "But we're closed every third Tuesday." And I said, "Well, but I didn't know that. How was I supposed to know that? If it says on the webpage you're open every Tuesday." But I had a backup plan. I went to a different archive, or have a long list of documents you want to see, because if something is being restored, there's really no way to know if you're going to get to it. Good news is no one else is going to get to it either, so you won't be scooped. At all points, manage your expectations. Be flexible. You just may not be able to get the documents you hoped for, or the description of the document may not actually match the document. In other words, it may promise something for you. It's a letter written from person A to person B on a particular date. You're absolutely sure this is what you need, but they're talking about something that has no relationship to what you're looking for. So can you still use that document? Be flexible somehow. Look for other forms of correspondence. Look for other people who are writing to each other, for example. And, the important thing is always, because you've spent a lot of time to get there, and you've asked, and I'm glad you pointed out this bit about letters of introduction. You've asked a lot of people to vouch for you. In some cases, you're not going to get past the door without someone vouching for you. So while you're there, make use of it.
Sorry, Kathleen. That's a very interesting point, because archives are places where serendipity does happen. I mean, you are looking for something which actually is not what you were expecting at all. But besides that, there are a couple of documents extremely interesting, and they were not in the webpage or
Right.
in the description of the archive. So in my experience, serendipity usually happens a lot in archives.
One of the things that has happened to me with some frequency is you're reading an article on the subject you're working on, and you find really great footnotes, and you copy that down and you say, "This is the document I want to see," and they say, "Everything's been recatalogued." So then you take a deep breath, okay, and you sit down with with the updated catalog, and you're gonna find stuff you didn't expect to find, because you went there for one thing and you had it in your mind, and now you're forced to think in other ways. So it's frustrating, but it's the kind of frustration that can open up a certain amount of creativity. I would never have looked in certain fonti in archives if all of the citations I was looking for had been correct. I would have missed a lot of stuff. And it's a strange thing to be grateful for, but I kind of am. And it has to do with being flexible and managing your expectations. Now, most of the archives and libraries that I've worked with in Italy ask you to provide a copy of the published works. You're going to have to pay for that yourself. There's no expiration date on that. So as a student, you can't afford always to purchase those copies or to mail those copies, but you can do it a few years later. The upside of this is that you'll be able to walk into an archive and see your book displayed, and people will recognize your name.
Yeah, that's for sure. They have a huge memory, and if you show there 10 years later or so, they are going to remember that you are the guy doing that specific research 10 years ago, and
Yep.
they still have not your book about that.
Right. Be prepared also to pay for different kinds of reproduction, and when I say it varies widely, I mean I got entire Fonti in Ferrara copied for €3. That's like 300 or 400 pages. In the Jesuit archive in Vatican City, to have not photocopied, photographed. To get a single scatto, which is one image, in the Jesuit archive costs €2. And I've seen everything in between. Sometimes you're going to have to pay far in advance to get that, and you'll get it months later, but you will get it. Just again, be flexible and manage your expectations. This is Trinity College in Dublin, a wonderful library that I was able to tour but not able to use the last time I was in Ireland because they were doing some restoration. But I did get into a couple of other places in Dublin. I've also done research in Belgium, Germany, England, and Spain, both in Madrid and in Barcelona. Language matters a lot. I understand that you all speak fluent English, and obviously you speak fluent Spanish. Understand that getting by is not the same as doing well, and so it's very similar to writing in advance versus coming with all of your documentation. You want somebody to help you, so you need to be welcoming to that person, just like you want them to be welcoming to you. And it varies a lot. In Barcelona, people are perfectly happy if I speak to them in Italian. They answer me in Catalan. We understand each other relatively well. They also speak English quite well. I've had trouble in Madrid. I don't speak Spanish well at all. And I get a lot of the upturned nose because there's an expectation for speaking Spanish. You will find very similar things in the United States about English. In Leuven, which is a university town, I was surprised at how easy it was to get by in English. And in Antwerp, I went into some places, some archives where they were like, okay, look, we speak Dutch here, you're not going to get by without Dutch. So try and figure out in advance where you're going to need what language. Private archives and libraries will charge you a fee. Unpredictable, always something that you'll find out on the website. Sometimes you'll be able to buy a weekly pass or a monthly pass instead of a day pass. But you will still have to pay. So like in the Gregorian University in Rome, you can buy a pass for a week versus a day. Again, costs for photography or electronic reproduction vary widely. Again, you should also bring your letters of presentation with you, but Belgium, Germany, England, and Ireland are not really that interested. There are not as ceremonial, so you don't have to lay it on really thick. So research methods. I want to show you the course description of the class that I'm teaching this semester. It is required for all history majors, and we're going to look at a variety of methods of historical research and interpretation, which is really broad. But the emphasis here is it's not just the facts, but what we see in them and what we do with them that counts. And we require students to write an original research paper and to present that in some way in class. We do reading, writing, and oral assignments. I do peer reviews, for example. teach the craft of history and the art of presenting it to others, which means that we emphasize that historical research and writing is a conversation, not just with the past, but with consumers of what work we're doing. So we need to, in other words, convince people of something. You have to write a thesis, which is convincing. You have to use material which other historians are using and put it into context. And so this is generally geared towards sophomores, second year students. And I take them through 3 levels of reading sources: the who, what, where, when, why, etc. Text plus context, so what it says and under what circumstances it was written, and for whom it was written. And there's a lot of audience questions. And that's just the most basic way of looking at a document. Level 2, taking you a little bit further, what's supposed to result from this document? How official versus formal, how angry versus friendly, etc. And questions of bias. Why are we talking about this particular thing? Who is talking about this particular thing? And for secondary sources, are we using things to make a case and to persuade us that this is a good case to make and that it has some basis in logic, and that you can be persuaded, in other words. And of course, we're working towards this level 3, which is the most sophisticated approach, because it builds on the other 2, but it also asks us a lot of so what questions. So what is the author, or what do the authors assume about their readers? Are we writing for a specialized audience versus people who know nothing about the subject and they want an introduction? Are we writing for people who we think will disagree with us? Are we preaching to the choir? What do we assume? In other words, what do we think readers are going to bring to the table? But also, what do we readers assume about the subject? What do we assume about the author, etc.? How is our understanding added to or brought to question by the specific text we're reading? And since we're going to be looking at more than one text like this, what patterns are emerging? So the overall point of the class then is not to say, okay, you're historians now. It's to say that these are long-term developments, but that you must always approach your sources and your audience with a series of questions. You respect the documents that you're using, but you also respect your readers. In formulating a thesis, you're going to ask a thought-provoking question.
May I, Kathleen?
I'm sorry?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, I was thinking, these students are technically sophomores. I mean, they are in the 4th semester of their studies. And these 3 different levels of reading sources, I think we all know that, and we agree completely with this kind of attention to biases and attention to the context of production of sources. But in our particular cases, we work not only with written sources, but also with images.
Right.
And that's a huge point, because in my experience, and they can talk too about their experiences, in my experience, people tend to see images as more neutral documents, as more innocent or candid sources than written text. So it's much easier for them be critical with written sources than with images. And this kind of my way of dealing with that is be very careful with images. Images has a powerful production context, they have powerful biases, they are produced by the elite, the social elites, the political elite. So that's very interesting because we agree with that, and at the same time we recognize the difficult of facing images as historical documents and be aware of potential biases in their readings. And that's I mean, we agree with this, and at the same time we recognize how difficult it is to be critical with images as itself in their ontologies.
Yes, and I think that's even harder with architecture and landscape architecture than it is with,
That's my major, so I agree with that too.
yeah, than it is with, say, sculpture or you know, all the various media that are visual. And it's, you know, most historians are text bound, but I think that one of the things that I work hard with my students is to remind them of the necessity of understanding that you know, these documents that we produce are produced in a visual context as well as in a literary context, and in a legal context, and so it matters a lot if you're seeing a document that, for example, is produced in a rural area versus a city, because of the visual experiences that people have. But I should also note, because I study Florentine history, I think I am probably more apt to use art historical sources than my colleagues who, for example, work in you know, different parts of Canadian history, or in the history of Berlin or something like that, because Florentine history has been dominated by art historians for a long period of time. And so I enjoy using art historical sources, but I find that most of my non-Florentine history colleagues don't embrace them nearly so much. And I think that's a mistake, because if you're talking about economic history, if you are talking about intellectual history, if you are talking about power, in terms of political history, then seeing the way that people value art and seeing the kind of art that they commission, I think provides you with a very important understanding of the economics and of the political context. I mean, you can talk about the way that people say they're powerful by demanding such and such, but if you look at a portrait, you get a really different interpretation of that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I should say, when we do talk about this in class, I make sure to note that documents and texts include a lot of things which are not necessarily written down. So it can include film. It can include art. It can include music. And I use document as shorthand because I'm a historian, not a musicologist, but I do make sure that they understand that. So I think we've lost the person who's doing the YouTube.
I'm sorry?
I think we've lost a participant. There were 3 windows open, but now there's just the 2.
I think it's our department, but they were trying to fix the YouTube issue.
Okay.
Yeah, but we are all here. Don't worry about it.
All right. What I tell my students about formulating a thesis is that you want analysis and evaluation of evidence, but you also want the audience to care. They don't have to care as much as you do. You're a nerd. This is your subject. You love it. But you want them to understand why you love it, right? And that might actually make them excited about it too. Probably not as excited about you, but it doesn't matter. You just want them interested enough to keep reading. And so within the thesis, you have to have a lot. It doesn't have to be a single sentence, but it has to be something which invites people in and says, join me in understanding this. We're going to resolve an issue. I thought of this question, and this is how we're going to resolve it. Another point of view, limited subject, precise opinion, and a blueprint of reasons. every semester I have at least one student tell me, I'll write the thesis later, I'll write the outline later after I write the paper. And then they hand me this mess, right? Because if you haven't thought it through in advance, then and you try writing from point A to point B, you're going to end up repeating yourself. You're going to end up forgetting the point that you started off with. It's not it's not a short story, right? It's proving a point. It involves learning what a good question is and what a bad question is. And actually, I emphasize bad questions a lot in my historical methods class so that we understand the pitfalls. An obviously biased question, a question that only has one possible answer, an imprecise or an untestable question, a yes or no question, or a fictional question. And of course, the metaphysical question about was something inevitable. There are people who find these questions interesting. They're generally not historians, and in my everyday life, I certainly ask plenty of yes/no questions, or questions with only one possible answer. But there are things like, did you take out the garbage? Did you feed the cat? That's not going to get me anything other than you stop at that point. Good questions, on the other hand, make you think. They allow you the flexibility of more than one possible answer. It's something that you can therefore have a long-term conversation with other people, with yourself, and with your sources about.
We've been doing that the last couple of months a lot.
Excellent.
And I think the most important part is a workable thesis. I mean, we really need things to be tested, to be proved, to be argumented, even against it. And I think they will agree with me that the point is not being stuck in something you cannot prove, you cannot test, you cannot argue with someone else about that. And I like very much something you just said about you don't need people to like your thesis, but being interested in it. I mean, it's more than enough if you love your point of view. You don't need the others to love it too, but they need to be interested in it. They need to learn something about what you are saying.
Right. And so there's some really good articles about the historian as detective. This sort of need to find the answer by looking at as many clues as possible, but also being open to new evidence changing your mind. Being open to the fact that sometimes you're not actually going to solve the case, but you're going to
you can prove that your point was wrong and not right, and that's okay.
Also true. It's frustrating result, but it is a perfectly valid result. So we also want to look at bad answers, right? Not just bad questions, but bad answers, because if you start off trying to prove a point as opposed to solving the case, you don't have any objectivity. You're going to see in the sources what you want to see. If you use some sort of historical or logical fallacies, I'm going to take one case and I'm going to say that it proves a larger point. Or if you're relying on generalizations or what Wikipedia calls weasel words, like many people think, these are bad answers because they don't actually demonstrate anything. They are not honest inquiries, in other words. Good answers.
Some historians say weasel words were originally in their abstracts, and we fought a lot about that.
Yes.
I mean, what's the meaning of some historians say? How many of them? Who are they? And when did they tell that?
Exactly. So you want to keep an open mind and you want to be honest, and you have to say to yourself sometimes, oh, I was so sure about this, but I was wrong. Excuse me. And Sometimes that happens at a conference and somebody asks you a question and you realize, I never thought about it that way, but I should have. And so you just say that. And sometimes it happens when you submit an article and people come back to you and say, you know, I know you want this to be true, but you're not really showing it. And then you have to start over. And it doesn't feel great. But in the end, you learn a lot from it. And you're always gonna get, no matter what the review is, if it's positive with this needs to be tweaked a bit, or it's you haven't used the right sources, you're going to learn something from the criticism, and you have to be open to that criticism. So in sum, good arguments use sound logic, they respect the sources and the audience, and they provide context as well as evidence, because you're not trying to win an argument, you're trying to persuade someone that you're solving the case. So you gather your evidence, you put it together in a logical and careful narrative, and you consider the opposing case. And this is hard. This is very hard to do, because you don't want to sound like you're undermining yourself, and you don't want to admit that this person who you disagree with could possibly be right. But you have to say to yourself, what's the possible hole in my argument?
Yeah.
What am I doing here that could be shown to be weak? What am I missing? And acknowledge that and say, but here's why. And that way you're going to convince your audience that you have the most sensible approach. So now we get to the why. Why do we do this? And I just pulled a couple of quotes from some different places. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation is obviously going to say, we engage in historical inquiry because we want the past to inspire us in some visual way. And in part, they're telling you this because they want you to give money to them, right? But they also want you to say, when somebody comes along and says, I want to take this land for development, the National Trust for Historic Preservation wants you to be on their side and say, no, old places are where our lives, memories, and stories begin. And that anchors us and leads us into the future. Famous historian William McNeill with the question, why study history? And he says it makes us wiser in our public choices, but also more human. And I generally tell my students that, I'm not studying history to prove something. I'm not studying history to change people's behavior in the future. I'm studying history because humans are ridiculously fascinating beings. And we love to tell each other stories about each other. And so, like, if that's the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning, learning about other human beings, then I'm not going to be an economist. I'm not going to be a lawyer. I'm going to look at the way that we speak to each other and the things that are important to us over a long period of time. And I think that that gives me empathy and wisdom about my present. It doesn't help me predict the future, you know. Yes?
If I may, Kathleen,
Sure.
I was thinking about Carol's work. Carolina is working about Greek mythology and the role of Greek mythology in Western thought all over the time. So this kind of the role of historical knowledge in our present lives, in our present destinies, and in our present situations, I think is one of the things that history makes the most important thing, or apportations of our lives. So I mean, every work here, every research here is important, but Kairos in particular, and the way as Greek myths have been seen not only in antiquity, but also in 18th, 19th, or 20th century, and the role that those myths played is a very important question even today.
And I don't know what it's like in Mexican popular culture, but in US popular culture, the ancient past is a volatile thing.
Oh yeah.
Uh, you know, and it has some very strong political connotations. So the more we
Yeah.
actually know about what it meant to people who lived then, the more we can fight this notion of Eurocentrism, of white dominance, and that sort of stuff. So good for Carlos for working on that. It is also a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it is as close as we get to a scientific approach to humanity. Data from the past serve as our most vital evidence in the fascinating quest to understand why our complex species behaves as it does in societal settings. It's a bit overwritten, but you understand the point here. You can't really do a lot of thought experiments because so much in the context changes, but we can learn a lot about what tests humans, not so that we fight better wars, but but so that we build societies which are more supportive of humans, so that we don't write laws which do some of the more shameful things in American history, like redlining, making it impossible for non-white people to buy houses in certain urban areas, for example. Art history, of course, is of particular interest to you all, but as I've said, it's of some interest to me too. I don't have the background in art history, obviously, that you all do, but because of the time that I've spent living in Florence, I understand what art does to you visually, and I understand the importance of not just looking at people for the actions that they have, but what they think is beautiful, what they value as something they want in their homes, what they want to wear, etc., how they want to present themselves. And I particularly love this one from Harvard because art history develops skills in visual discrimination and verbal expression. You know, right now we live in this AI age, which is scary in a lot of ways. And art historians are going to help save us from some of the worst excesses. What computer nerds want to do is make something new and cool and fun, and they don't focus on the impact. But you all do. And you teach us the importance of what is real versus what is constructed, the difference between what a human being can do and what a machine can do. And finally, from Georgetown, it's one of the best ways to challenge our ideas and assumptions about the world. The so what then? Why do we do this? Is not just because it matters, because it's pretty, but because it teaches us to be aware of the limits and challenges of evidence and claims of knowledge. History is fundamentally committed to dialogue and skepticism. And that means you individually have to be committed to it in order to avoid dogmatic or authoritarian interpretations. In other words, when you are talking about the records of whatever kind, cave paintings, a museum itself, written documentation, laws, etc. The analysis of the records left behind by our predecessors and undertaken with integrity, but also with genuine curiosity. Going to teach us to be better thinkers, but also better societal actors, because it reminds us of the necessity of evidence, context, and logic. So that is the end of my presentation. And I am happy now to address any, thank you, to address any questions or comments that you have.
I'm pretty sure they will have a lot of questions, but first of all, thank you very much. I want to thank you twice because many of the things you just said have been said in this classroom in the last 8, 10 weeks, and I would like to highlight a couple of things you just said at the end. One of them is integrity. And I think in this university, I Jesuit university, by the way, we are very aware of the importance of integrity in all aspects of daily life, but also in professional development. So I think they are completely aware about how important it is to be in pursuit of this kind of integral and integrity professional jobs. The second thing I would like to highlight is skepticism and being critical. I would like they to say that in my opinion it's very important to be critical with everyone here. With everything is said in this classroom is tested and argued and discussed about. So I really hope they don't take me for granted. They don't take anything that I can say just because I said it. I hope so. I hope they are critical human beings because they are going to be citizens. And at this point of history, we really need to be critical and aware citizens because if not, we are probably doomed.
Right. No, I agree. I agree.
Anyway, again, double thank you. We really appreciate you doing this, and I learned a lot. I know they learned a lot, and I know they have a number of questions, at least a couple for every one of you girls. So go for it. And I would like a couple of words about your research. I
Yes,
would
please.
love if you are able to tell Kathleen in a couple of sentences, I am doing this. Anyone?
I can.
Done.
Hi, my name is Daniela,
Hi.
and you gotta see me, but hi.
There you are.
And I am working on a specific type of like story called La Belle Dame sans Merci. It's like the beautiful lady without pity,
Yeah.
and it's specifically on pre-rap like art.
Okay.
And I'm looking to to analyze it with a different. It's not a theory, but it's like a kind of a theory of how the monstrous feminine is built with these images of fatal woman or femme fatales, and I want to go with that direction. And I wanted to ask you because when you said that in some places when you go to the archives, they're not gonna speak English. But what to do if you don't speak their language?
Dutch, German.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that you can prepare for in advance. So you'd want to, for example, if you're going to Berlin, if you're going to well, that's not a great museum town, Berlin, with the exception of the Museum Island, they surprisingly have few Renaissance things, so you'd want to go someplace else. But if you're going someplace where you're sure that you can't handle the language, I would write in advance and say that this is a handicap for you, that you feel comfortable reading whatever documents they have, using whatever sources they can present to you, because they might be in Latin, they might be in Spanish, they might be in English, but that you probably will need some help. And is there somebody there who speaks your language so that you can identify this person in advance? They will. These days, it's probable that the response that you'll get will be at least partly Google translated, which is okay, excuse me. but that's not going to help you very much face to face. So you want to, you just want to identify that as a problem in advance.
Okay, thank you.
Other question? Dos por cada una, por favor. Si no, pide punto menos. Kai.
Hi, my name is Kyla, and first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very helpful to see how we can improve our research. And my research is about the Rothko Chapel in Houston and how the spirituality of Rothko helped him create the paintings inside the chapel. And question, what has been your most difficult, like, what difficulties have you encountered in your research?
Huge number of them.
Yes, there's there's a lot of categories there. You know, it's hard to get funding. It is.
I'm sorry, Kathleen. I was just about asking something about that. You've
Okay.
been traveling a lot. I mean, you've been almost everywhere in the world, and that's James Clifton's one of favorite sentences. James is always saying, "I've not been everywhere." Anyway, what's the percentage of you have funded travel or fellowships or grants or no? I mean, half of
Okay.
it, 1/3, 2/3.
That's a good question. So there's of course different kinds of funding. There's funding from the institution that you call home, right?
Yeah.
And I've gotten a fair amount of support that way. It almost never covers everything. So, you know, you'll get something like airfare or lodging or something like that. And then there is the external grant that you can apply for. And those rarely cover everything. So I would say even with, I mean, most of the funding that I've gotten has been below $5,000. I don't know how that translates into pesos. But especially if,
6,000 pesos.
okay, so I was going to say, but especially if you're working in Houston, you're familiar with dollars, and how much they're worth. So I always spend some of my own money. And there was a time in the US where you could deduct what you spent as it was considered continuing education or work related expenses, but you can't do that anymore. So research has gotten a lot more expensive. I would say probably if I were to work it out, it's probably 1/3 of the research that I've done has been supported, which is frustrating. And, you know, I continue to do it because I absolutely love it. I'm completely obsessed by these things, but also because it is a requirement for my job, which means that because of the research that I've done, I have gotten certain raises. And that makes it harder to count how much of my research is being funded because, like, I can say I spent X amount of dollars on this book, but then from that, I get, you know, some of my colleagues may get a $500 raise and I get a $1,500 raise, which is permanent and it sticks with me for the coming years.
The final point here is at the end, you can find it yourself with your own funds.
Yeah, I can. I'm lucky that way. And not everybody is that lucky. And one of the things that I would suggest that is really important to keep in mind is that, as with everything else in life, the rich get richer, which means that if you get a grant, you're more likely to get another grant. And it's hard to get the first one. and it isn't easy to get the second or third one, but it becomes easier when you have proven that because as a result of this grant, I did such and such. So the very first grant I got was $800. And after that, I got $1,000 one. And then, it's, these small ones do add up to a lot, but I also know some people who got $25,000 grants, and I've never gotten anything on that scale. And that's in part because of where I work. Those $25,000 grants go to people who teach at Yale and at Princeton, and they don't go to people who teach at Georgia Southern University. So again, it's about the rich getting richer. That's one challenge.
That's Ivy League's grant.
Sorry?
That's Ivy League's.
Yes, indeed. Another difficulty, I didn't walk into this terribly mature with a great deal of flexibility. I had to learn to be flexible because I frequently got answers like I just mentioned before, like people in so the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze is not only the most important library in Tuscany, it is the first branch of the National Library of Italy. The one in Rome was founded later, even though Rome's the capital. It is an exceptionally large and beautiful building with all kinds of resources, and it's so hard to use. And so, at a certain point, I remember, because I lived there for 6 months while I was doing my dissertation research. And at a certain point in time, they kept telling me I couldn't get these books because they were alluvionato. They were destroyed in the 1966 flood, including books which were published after 1966. They just, and they had a computer set up for the catalog, but it was only the new books that were coming in. So I had to use this old catalog, which was written in this 19th century Euro scrawl that, Americans have very different handwriting than Italians. And so, over the years, I just learned that this is going to happen. I talked to friends who research in France and research in Spain, and it happens. The cataloging systems are not great. Not everybody who works there wants to be there that day. They may not help you. I even had some books that I tried to get, and they were in the card catalog, so I requested it, and they told me Napoleon stole that one. I was like, Napoleon? You haven't updated your catalog since Napoleon. Excuse me. So all of the stuff that has frustrated me, I have learned to make funny stories out of, and I have learned to build in extra time. If you're going to go to someplace and you think it'll take you 2 days to research, stay there for 5.
Absolutely.
And you're going to get a fair number of no's, and so you just need to learn how to ask questions. And sometimes it's like a keyword search in your library catalog, like that there's a book about a particular subject, and you look up that subject and you can't find the book, and you're certain because you've seen this book before, you've used it, you've quoted it, it's there. So you try different keywords, and you do that face to face with people too, because somebody asks me a question, I don't always remember the answer, and then they ask me a question in a different way, and I do. So that which does not kill you makes you stronger, and all that.
It's a very useful conversation with a librarian. I've seen this book a couple of years ago. No, this book doesn't exist.
Right.
It's not here. I had it 5 times. I mean, and that's very useful. And yet, it's a fascinating job. It's wonderful. I mean, I remember fondly when I first arrived to Mexico and first knew the Mexican archives, especially the Inquisition ones. It's fascinating the things you can find and knew about, and it's like a professional gossip job.
It's true.
I love that.
That's true.
Pau, Carol, any question
Um,
or talking about your research?
well, hi, my name is Paulina. I'm doing a study on Botticelli's unfinished works about
La Divina
La Divina Commedia, and how is that possibly related to Savonarola and his preaching.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Florentine-
exactly my thoughts.
Florentine subject.
Exactly my thoughts.
And my question would be, what do you think about, all those documents that archives or libraries have, and they are rare documents, important documents, and they are not allowed to the public. They are not, like, I can't go and ask for it. Like, do you think it's good? Do you think it's...
Estás hablando de los fondos reservados que no muestra al público.
Yeah.
She's talking about reserve funds that they are not public allowed. They are like the secret libraries in the Vatican
Right.
City.
Right. Well, some of that has to do with Italian law, and you're just never going to get around it. There are every municipality, whether it's like, the US government all the way down to the mayor of Florence, has some sort of restriction on things that you can or can't see. So one thing to remember is most other people can't either. So you're not going to get scooped. You're not going to have somebody come in and say, she should have read this because it's not available. Okay. I'm not familiar with exactly what it is that you're working on, but I do know that there are there's a lot of things written and published in the 19th century by German and Italian historians as part of this movement that's called the Gesellschaft. So like in 19th century, as Germany is unifying, there's all this rhetoric about what the future of Germany is, and it's all very anti-Austrian because Austrians are not heavily industrialized, but they're also Catholic. And real Germans are Lutheran. And so they're going to work to ensure that everybody understands that the future is all about this Protestant work ethic and Weber and all this sort of stuff. And Catholic is backwards. So a group of Catholic Germans, because there are plenty of them, said, no, come on, this isn't really true. And they started this school called the Gesellschaft to promote Catholic history. And that's how you get von Ranke's History of the Popes. And there's another German History of the Popes that's considerably longer. And they publish a lot of documents there. And some of those are no longer available because of the world wars and all that destruction. Some of those were only available to them. And in the current work that I'm doing, I have found that there's similar cases of people transcribing and publishing documents in Italian history that the documents have disappeared over the years. So it is possible that you can find references to these documents, if not complete or partial transcripts, at least, of some of these documents. Who can access these documents? Is it like only members of the Dominican order? Like you personally can't.
Excuse me, what was the question?
¿Has encontrado documentos que no puedes consultar? O sea, si crees que hay algún documento que te ayudaría que no puedes consultar y están restringidos.
I mean, like the drawings are, but there's pictures of them on the internet, so it's not a problem.
Mhm.
The
Documentos escritos.
writing documents, I think, till now, I have been able to consult all of them, but it was just like a question.
Okay. I mean, there's a general attitude among scholars that you should always go to the original yourself. That's not always possible. It can be extremely expensive to go to the original yourself. It can be it's possible that it's in a language that you are relatively weak in or you don't know at all. There's no real shame in using transcriptions or translations. You just identify them as a transcription or a translation.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of us have to rely on that.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Do you want to say something, Carol?
Yeah, I do have a question. Remember how you said that we shouldn't fall into like weasel words or something?
Right.
I'm kind of, I feel like I'm stuck there because I'm doing a research paper on Achilles and Patroclus. And I do start like a certain chapter by saying that many people have studied Achilles through his fury and through his wrath, and I don't want to do that. So how do I like escape that kind of sentence or like,
Right.
yeah.
It's a two-pronged question. So first of all, if you want to stick with many, then make sure you have a footnote that has lots of examples.
Okay.
If you want to move away from many, which I would suggest doing, go back to this idea that you're the one asking the question. You're the one doing the research, which, as hard as it may feel in the beginning, means that you're developing into some sort of an expert on this. You're not the greatest expert who's ever lived. You're not going to be the last expert who's ever done this, but you will have expertise. So you shouldn't feel like you need to apologize. And a lot of times when I read somebody saying others have said, and some people feel like, it's like they're trying to say something controversial, but they hope you won't notice. Excuse me. You want people to notice. It's very difficult to take a risk like that. And so if it helps you write out the documentation and say, these include, in this was particularly important in the 1960s in feminist studies when people said X, Y, and Z, and then you give a bunch of examples. But you don't have to apologize for looking into something and coming up with your own ideas about it. And you don't have to hide the fact that you have new ideas about it. You are literally, by the work that you are doing, you're challenging something. And challenging is hard. And you worry that maybe they'll find what you wrote and they'll disagree with your interpretation. Ooh, what will happen then? So bring the receipts, as we say in the US. Make sure.
I don't want to call out names though.
Sorry?
I don't want to call out names and be like, this person has said it, so they're wrong.
But you have to, because
That's for sure.
Because that's the conversation that you're having. So like you can say, I mean, as we've just heard from your very own professor, you are supposed to be able to have a conversation with him. So you're quoting him positively, as Cuesta says, right? But you have to do that also when you're quoting them negatively, because it respects the work that they've done. And even if they're wrong about something, I would like to think that I am mature enough that if somebody quotes me and says her interpretation of this is wrong, that within at least a couple of weeks I will get over it. Excuse me. And in fact, one of the things I'm doing right now, there's this woman who's written a biography of Bianca Capello, and she quoted me, and it was in a very negative and insulting way. And so, I put it down. I complained to some friends. And then I read a bunch of other things, and I said to myself, you know what? You're right, and she's wrong. And by the way, she also insults a whole bunch of other people because she seems not particularly like Americans who do Italian history. So that's not my problem. That's her problem. And so
that's important. I think that there are a number of ways to tell things.
Yeah.
Some of them are most polite than others.
Right.
I mean, you can always say, I don't fully agree with Cuesta in something he said, but that's completely different, and he's completely wrong.
And I will say that every time that it's happened, you know, whether it's in a review of the published book or in a pre-publication review or at a conference or in this particular case, that what it has always done is it has always made me feel like I need to go back and look closely at what I've said and closely at what I've written and closely at what I've read and make sure that I am correct, but also clear.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I meant something, but it didn't come out that way. And so, in other words, nobody wants to be insulted, but we can turn that into an experience that keeps me honest and says, okay, you know, like, I guess you could have read it that way. Now she's insulting about it, but she could have read it that way. So I need to work on that. That is my problem.
Yeah, that's what professional integrity feels about.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, we are delighted of being here in this conversation, but we really need to let you go. You have a lot of things to do, and really we appreciate a lot you being here today, and I learned a lot. I'm pretty sure they learned a lot, and thank you very much, Kathleen. And if not before, we see each other in Toronto, right?
Absolutely. And I want to thank you so much for asking me to do this. I enjoyed very much pulling this together and speaking with your students. And of course, you have my email address. You should feel free to give it to your students in case they have follow-up questions. I'd be happy to try and answer them. And this has been great fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathleen.
Thank you.
See you.
See you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.